Welcome everyone, what's up warrior students. In my last guide I promised that we are going to do a Cleave guide video for the Arms Warrior in the prepatch. And so yeah, here we go. Let's talk about Arms Warrior Aoe and Cleave in prepatch Wrath. So doing DPS against more than one target is a lot more dynamic than your standard single target rotation, which makes it very fun for me, but also more difficult for sure. You always need to judge how long the fight is gonna be and the amount of targets that are present, and for example, is there a mob that is lower level than the others, because if you would focus him with your auto attacks he would generate more rage. And then if there is a target that is very low HP, do you want to execute it or do you want to leave it there so you can hit it with your next whirlwind as well? Things like this. So yeah, there's a lot that you want to look out for, and like I said in my last guide, if you want to be able to make the right decisions in all of those situations, you need to know how your spells compare and how they perform. So again, we will talk about a couple of spells before we go into the build and the rotation. Okay, let's go. Alright, let's compare all the spells. Now, for comparing the spells in damage per cast and damage per rage, in AoE it's a little bit more work, basically, because there can be 2 targets, there can be 3 targets or whatever, and therefore we have to talk about this a little bit. Here on the left side you see the damage comparison in single target from the last video, and over here on the right side this is the one for multi-target. So we don't need this. You can see that there's quite a lot of change, but we don't need this right now. So let's talk about the spells. So in damage per cast our best friend is Blade Storm for obvious reasons, and then we have Sweeping Strikes. With Sweeping Strikes and Whirlwind, it depends on how many crits the Whirlwind will land, because even though a crit that is duplicated by Sweeping Strikes will deal more damage, obviously, but it will not apply deep wounds. So yeah, it depends on how much crit you get with your Whirlwind. And then we have Cleave, Rend and Overpower, and this comparison here is made pretty much on like 3 targets, and Cleave is enhanced by the Glyph of Cleaving, which increases the numbers of targets that Cleave will hit by 1, and Rend is enhanced with Glyph of Rending. So if you don't use Glyph of Rending, then Rend falls off the cliff here, but because Overpower is still so strong, you still would want to rend at least 1 target, even if you don't have Glyph of Rending. And then on damage per rage, again Blade Storm on top, no question about that. And then we have Overpower, because it's very strong. It only costs 5 rage, this is the main reason, and 5 rage is like nothing. And then we have Rend, because it only costs 10 rage. However, here we have a lot of like if or thens, because again it's a matter of critical effects, because Rend cannot crit, but Rend deals a good amount of damage, and if Whirlwind really crits like 3 or 4 targets, then it's a lot better than Rend actually. And then we have Sweeping Strikes here, which again depends on the crit luck that you have with your Whirlwind or the amount of crit that you have on your character sheet. And then all the way to the bottom we have Cleave, only because Cleave consumes your next auto attack, and your auto attack can generate up to like 40 rage, so Cleave can cost up to 60, which is insane, and 2 extra attacks for 60 rage. It's obviously a very bad trade, and therefore it's all the way to the bottom here. However, it still has its uses, and we will talk about them in the rotation part. So how will the priorities or those comparison here change with the amounts of targets? So on 3 targets with Glyph of Cleaving, it's pretty much like this, and on 2 targets there will be a lot of change, because on 2 targets you can only hit 2 targets with your Whirlwind, for example. In damage per cast it will keep its spot basically on 3rd. However, it will never be able to surpass Sweeping Strikes in this scenario, and the same goes for damage per rage, like it pretty much stays here, but it will never be able to surpass Sweeping Strikes and on 2 targets it will not be able to surpass rend, like it would be on like 3 or 4 targets with crit luck. So yeah, this means on 2 targets it's still a good button for damage per cast, but in damage per rage it's really bad, so sometimes you want to consider maybe prioritizing rend and overpower over real rend. Now as for Cleave, if there are only 2 targets, or if you don't use the glyph of cleaving, because it's basically the same thing, then Cleave is in damage per cast all the way to the bottom, and yeah, damage per rage is already down here. But what does it mean? This means that you want to use Cleave basically as you would use Heroic Strike, so only as a method to stop yourself from overcapping rage and to enable some nice stance drops, but more to this in the rotation part. And now we can move on to the build. Alright, so as for the talent build for level 70, there isn't really much change to the single target version. Most of the changes lie in the glyphs, and yeah, so let's talk about the talents that I think have different value in AoE than in single target. First would be trauma. So I don't expect the feral tank to mangle every single mob, because your tanks are assigned for different mobs and they don't really touch the others. And I especially don't expect the cat to mangle all the targets. And if you pick up trauma every time you crit someone, trauma will be applied, which is a great DPS increase for yourself and everyone else who uses bleeds on trash pulls. And then we have anger management, which is always pretty good if you are running from pool to pool, so it will save you a lot of rage. So this is something I like as well. And something you don't need for multi-target is improved mortal strike, for example. It's really not that needed. It's really not that good for AoE, because yeah, obvious reasons. And then on Fury we have Armor to the Teeth and Cruelty. Now some of you guys might think about picking up Insight. However, if you want to do so, you need to sacrifice points that go into Cruelty or Armor to the Teeth. And improving the crit chance of your Thunderclap and your Cleave is not a bad idea. It's quite decent, but the problem is that Cruelty and Armor to the Teeth is just so much better. Your 2 best buttons for AoE are Whirlwind and Bladestorm. Insight doesn't improve Whirlwind or Bladestorm, and it doesn't increase your rend damage, it doesn't increase your overpower damage, it doesn't increase your deep runes damage like Armor to the Teeth would. And your Cruelty obviously will increase all your spells, including Cleave and including Thunderclap, but also improving your 2 most important spells, and as well Armor to the Teeth. Increase Thunderclap, increase your bleeds, increase your Cleave, and increase your 2 most important spells. So it's really not worth it to go for Insight on this level, like on level 70. On level 80, that's a different story. We don't need to sacrifice so important talents for Insight, and therefore we can go for it if you want. And then for glyphs, one glyph that is pretty much locked in is Glyph of Cleaving, but it's not that necessary. However, it's pretty nice. It will it has some great potential, because it's only really a good option if there are 3 or more mobs, and if you don't use Glyph of Cleaving, you will change your rotation in a way that not having the glyph actually doesn't hurt as much as you might think. However, it's still a really good thing. And then the next glyph is very optional and very situational, because we could use Glyph of Rending. Glyph of Rending is extremely good even in AoE if the targets live long enough. If they don't live long enough, Glyph of Rending becomes pretty useless. And then we don't want to use Glyph of Execution, but we could use Glyph of Bladestorm. Now, Glyph of Bladestorm can do nothing if it doesn't increase the amounts of Bladestorm that you can cast. If it do, however, increases the number of Bladestorm that you would cast over the duration of a dungeon by a good amount, then Glyph of Bladestorm is really, really strong. So yeah, maybe you want to go for Glyph of Bladestorm if this glyph is available. I don't know which glyphs are available, but yeah, I will give you a perspective on all the glyphs so you can see what glyph you want to use when you know which are available and which not. And then the next glyph that you could consider is Glyph of Sweeping Strikes, because yeah, obviously it's a great convenience to make your sweeping strikes free. However, if you manage your rage correctly and everything, you don't really need this glyph. This glyph is extremely bursty, like it's for charge in and go all out right away, which most of the time will result in aggro, and yeah, depend on how hard the mobs will hit, you will die because of this. So Glyph of Sweeping Strikes is questionable, but still kind of fun and has its uses. At the same time, if you have decent gear, you will be able to almost permanently queue up Cleave and use Whirlwind on cooldown. So Glyph of Cleaving, the extra rage you gain from this, like 30 rage every 30 seconds, will basically be dumped in a Mortal Strike most likely, or maybe an Execute. So yeah, it rarely has some nice value, I would say, if you are able to, like, if you are able to manage your rage correctly. And then we have the minor glyphs, who are again very minor, so if you can, if they are available, you want to pick up the glyph for your shout as always. And then Glyph of Thunderclap is, yeah, 2 yards. It isn't really a big deal. Yeah, I would recommend Glyph of Charge pretty much always, I guess. Glyph of Blood Rage, yeah, this is the healer's drop. Like, if you deal damage to yourself, you will be healed. And then, yeah, Glyph of Mocking Blow. You're like, yeah, maybe you want to pull out a mob from the tank so you get more rage, so you can cast more abilities. If you can afford that, or if you're allowed to do that, then obviously Glyph of Mocking Blow is again a really strong tool. Alright, Aoe Rotation. So, very dynamic. A lot of things are going to have an impact on your decision making and what buttons is the best to press. But the basic idea is to get as much value out of your damage per cast efficient spells as possible, being Bladestorm, Sweeping Strikes and Whirlwind, and use the time in between when those spells are on cooldown to spread rend, use Overpower, and then you want to use your Cleave for excess rage. You want to balance your rage level on a fairly low amount so that you are able to perform clean stance swaps without losing too much rage to get out a Whirlwind and then swap back to battle stance. We are going to look at 3 clips. Those clips are recorded on the private server, yes. And yes, my character is level 80, but I only use 2 glyphs, I only use 61 talent points, and all the spells that we are going to use work exactly the same like they do on the Wrath classic version that Blizzard will give us. The only difference is that the private server runs a little bit more smooth than the PTR for me, and that Blizzard never gave us a good cluster of training dummies that you can use to practice your area and Cleave rotation on a warrior if you are level 70. In the first clip we are going to see an opener that I use to get a lot of damage out very fast, and this opener is Charge. Go into Berserker stance, use a macro that uses all your damage cities other than Sweeping Strikes and Recklessness, cast a Whirlwind, go into Bladestorm. While you're Bladestorming, spam a macro that will use Recklessness, Sweeping Strikes and queue up Cleave, and then go for one more Whirlwind after the Bladestorm and try to dump your rage so that you can swap back to battle stance, and then you rend up targets that will be alive for a decent time. You can speed up this opener by a little bit by using your Recklessness and your Sweeping Strikes before you go into Bladestorm, but this would be just an awful amount of ridiculous burst damage that will guarantee you to pull threat unless there is a AoE taunt. And the problem is that Recklessness will have less value on your Bladestorm than on Cleave, for example. You could as well go for Retaliation Bladestorm. So if you're going to pull threat and mobs are going to attack you, you are going to hit them back for some extra damage. Remember that we can retaliation, shield wall and recklessness individually every 5 minutes. Alright, the next opener is a lot slower. You charge in, you use everything that gives you attack power, you went up 2 to 3 targets, then you go into Berserker stance, you use everything that would give you crit, haste or armor penetration, you use whirlwind, and then you go into Blade Storm and you spam your macro for recklessness, sweeping strikes and cleave. And in this last clip I do not have Glyph of Cleaving equipped, so I will use Cleave basically how you would use Heroic Strike on single target. With one exception, I still use it as a tool to make a window for a nice stance swap. Alright, that is everything that I've got for you right now in terms of AoE and Cleave DPS for the Arms Warrior in the Wrath Classic pre-patch. Now I could talk about more things, but we are short on time, or I'm short on time, because I want to give you those guys before the pre-patch hits, and I think it hits actually today, yeah. So this is why this video is a little bit rushed. However, everything I say is pretty much accurate, and watching this video was actually the easy part, because this rotation requires a lot of practice. But as always, I hope you learned something, and we will see each other in the next one. Until then, stay tuned, take care.